Welcome. Thank you, John. And thank you, all of you, for being here tonight. It's great to see that there is some interest in Christian mysticism, and particularly on the life and teachings of Saint Teresa of Avila. For those of you who don't know me, I have to warn you that I am neither a nun nor a scholar. So whatever I'm going to share with you tonight is the fruit of my own search, my own curiosity, and a little bit of practice. I can say that at least I was raised Christian within the Catholic Church, but also within the Theosophical Society's frame of mind, or so. And so I learned to pray at the same time that I learned to meditate. And I didn't really see much of a difference between these two. And later on confirmed that with Teresa's teachings. Within the talk, I will probably mention other traditions as well as the Christian tradition, because what you find when you read or look into the lives of the mystics is that what they say transcends their own religion. And you find the same pearls in all of them. And there is certain joy in finding those. You see, there is this common thread. It is it's tremendously inspiring. So there is a lot to share tonight, and I will only be able to share some of it. And particularly about her life and some important details of what she considered to be important. And this weekend, this Saturday, we will continue with her practice, what she taught as prayer. So Saint Teresa stepped into my life unexpectedly. One day I was walking through the bookstore, and this book kind of fell from the shelf. And I got it, and I saw Saint Teresa of Avila, Passionate Mystic. And this is a book by Mirabai Starr. It's been very inspiring. It's a tiny little book on the accounts of her life, many stories, and some quotes from her, some of her poetry. So that inspired me to continue the search and to look into her other works. The one thing that I find most inspiring about the mystics is that they seem to be very real people. Common to some extent, extraordinary as well. But people with real struggles, and who share those struggles with those who are also seeking. So that is quite precious. You'll find that they are so incredibly courageous, and with this yearning desire to become one with God. And I think we can all identify with that as well. So apart from the book I just showed you, there are many other books that were written about her. Now, the books that she wrote, a few of them are listed here, the most important ones. Life of Saint Teresa of Avila, a book it's an autobiography. So it's called Vida. The Way of Perfection, which is a book she wrote for the nuns in the first convent that she founded. So it was specifically written for them, but we can all benefit from the advice that she gives there. Then you have The Interior Castle, which is probably her magnum opus. It is a book that was written after a vision that she had of the soul. She had this vision of the soul being a diamond, and like in the form of a castle that had inside 7 mansions and rooms within those mansions. So she describes each of these mansions as states of prayer, or I would say states of consciousness, how the journey of the soul within, and that's why it's called The Interior Castle, about the teaching of prayer. Then she wrote Book of Foundations with other type of advice. Meditations on Song of Songs is commentary on the Lord's Prayer. The Letters of Saint Teresa of Jesus is a compilation of letters that she wrote to others, and then some minor works from her as well. So some impressions first about Teresa. Reading her is not easy. It's not like reading a contemporary book. You have to, most of all, navigate through her apologetic writing. There is a combination of genuine humility, but also the fact that she was a nun in the 1500s, having visions and mystical experiences. So all her confessors were men, and she didn't think she knew what she was talking about. Of course, she was wrong about that, because she was later on, centuries after that, considered one of the doctors of the church, the first female doctor to be considered the doctor of the church, because of her contribution to theology and doctrine. So everything she wrote was requested. It wasn't something that she one day she sat and said, oh, I'm going to write something about this. No, it was requested from either the nuns at the convent or her confessors or the priests that were, like she says, in charge of her soul. So she had to be very careful with what she wrote. Her books, the first one, and In the Way of Perfection, she says at some point, Father Prestado, which was her confessor at the time, who will be the first to read this book, will either make corrections or burn it. So she didn't know which way it was going to go, but in any case, she presented her wisdom in them. So a little bit about her early life. She was born in 1515 in Gotarrendura, the province of Avila, Spain. When she was 14, her mother died. That was a huge event in her life, being a girl. But from the beginning, she was very much inspired by religion, and especially Christianity and prayer. At the age of 20, she decided to enter the Carmelite monastery, a little bit against her father's wishes, but then with her father's blessing. Within the monastery, she got very ill, and they tried several treatments on her. None of them worked, so her father took her back home to die. And she actually did, to some extent. She fell into a coma for a few days. And when they were about to consider her dead, her father leaned on her and realized that she was breathing, that there were some signs of life. And at that moment, they realized that she was alive and helped her kind of come out of that state. Imagine at that time, they didn't have enough resources to deal with those type of things. But she came back to life. The only thing she could do was to blink her eyes, and then little by little move a finger. And after months, 8 months, she was able to move her limbs, and it took her 2 years to crawl. So she re-taught herself to walk. And that tells you about her will and her power. Even during her time of illness, she experienced periods of religious ecstasy. And the book that inspired her tremendously, it was the only book that she carried with her everywhere. Actually, a lot of the images that you see of her and statues, she's carrying a book. I wonder if it's that one, because in her accounts, that's the only book she actually seemed to have read. And this book was the third spiritual alphabet by Francisco de Osuna, who was also a mystic. I was shocked to find out that this book is available, not only in the library, but on Amazon. So it's a big book, And I recommend it, highly recommend it. Teresa was very genuine. She had an exceptional intellect. But this intellect was balanced by her very passionate emotions. So she had a heart and a mind that were strong. And she says that one of her the greatest obstacle that she had, but it turned out to be her most effective weapon, was that she liked to be liked. So for a person who is trying to transcend whatever others think of you, that was an obstacle. But for someone who was having visions and mystical experiences, it was a blessing because she was very charismatic and was able to navigate through this with ease because she liked to be liked and people liked her. And sometimes while I read her, I became kind of concerned about her because you can see that she was really a gem. And she was so much around other people who were in control of what she was experiencing and were the judges of what she was experiencing, that you feel at some point, is she going to make it? And is she going to meet the right people? And fortunately, she did. And that's why she lived until she was older enough to die of illness. One of the primary fruits of Teresa's inner experiences was the realization that no intermediaries were needed for the soul to achieve union with God. And this was kind of a revelation at that time, right? We didn't need anybody else to take us there. We can just go within and find God within. So we have the Christian mysticism in the golden age of Spain. And here it just listed these three mystics, but there were so many more. Francisco de Osuna was the author of the book that Teresa read, St. Teresa of Avila, 1515 to 1582, and then St. John of the Cross, 1542, 1591. St. Teresa was 27 years older than him. And this is something that very few people know, but Teresa was St. John of the Cross's friend and mentor. So she was in a way a mentor because she was the one who started the Reformation. But then St. John's inner development was as great as hers, or even beyond. Of course, nobody can judge that. But they are very, very close and very good friends and supported each other in their growth. When she had these moments of ecstasy, she would have, at times, visions and experiences that were not of this world. So when she shared, this is a quote from her, this is when she shared the details, it's actually from Mirabai Star. When she shared the details of her visions and voices with the men in charge of her soul, they were overcome with either reverence or suspicion. But no one was capable of investigating Teresa more thoroughly than she was already investigating herself. She subjected every one of her mystical favors to rigorous self-inquiry. She was determined to discern whether her visions came from God, were delusions of the devil, like she would say, or were artifacts of mental imbalance. In spite of the doubts of some, she concluded that her experiences were divine in origin because they left life-changing peace in her soul and an irrevocable increase of love in her heart. The one thing that I want to point out the most is this rigorous self-inquiry that she had. Yeah, she was very brave to just see herself as she was and not to be afraid of not trusting the visions and asking the visions and checking with other people. She would go to learn men within the church and speak about what she experienced and ask them to find those things in books or and to corroborate for her. She was really a seeker. She was seeking for the truth of it. Getting inside the mind and the heart of a mystic can turn your life upside down or inside out, and hopefully change your life for good. Normally, we are quite concerned about our self-image. And, we think a lot about how others see us, what others think of us. And we focus much more, quite a lot, on that external part of it, of life. But for a mystic and for a spiritual person in general, all that matters is our relationship with God. It is between me and God. She writes a beautiful poem that I'm not going to be able to share with you today. That one in particular is very long. But at the very end of that poem, she says, "Let me prove my worth in solitude." And solitude meant with herself, but also with God. So it doesn't really matter what's on the surface or what is happening in the outside with the rest of the world, but what is happening with my conversation with God is what really matters. When there is this honest attempt to follow the footsteps of a saint, and it doesn't mean that we're going to try to follow exactly those footsteps, because that's impossible. We're all unique and different, and we're going to follow our own path, not anybody else's, hopefully. But when we attempt to live the teachings, we realize that it requires a commitment to change to some extent. Some of the things that we're doing right now need to be adjusted, and so there's the need of this courage inside to change those things. We cannot remain who we are and at the same time walk this journey and get closer to the divinity. So she says things that if you really want to put in practice, it can change your life, right? She says, "How good and true will be the love of the sister," she's talking to her nuns, "who can help others by setting aside her own advantage for their own sake. She will make much progress in all the virtues." So definitely she was the real deal. And in that, we will see it along the way as part of her teaching. One of the things that stands out the most when it comes to her, and probably every spiritual person, is this absolute trust in a higher power. Trusting in the great goodness of God, who never fails to help anyone who is determined to give up everything for him. So what happens normally is that we're not ready to give everything. We just want to give what we're ready to give at this point, which is a little bit of what we want and keep the other, which is fine. The only thing that we need to take into account is that if we don't give everything, we don't get everything as return. So it's in a way, it's simple math if we want to see it from that side. So this particular time in our culture is, it runs a little bit around getting what we want to be the most important thing. But even following the Lord's Prayer, when it says, "Lord, thy will be done," and that is, come what may. This is not my own will. It is a much more powerful force that is going to take me to the place that I need to go. So at some point she says something very important. She says, do not fear that he will fail you. And if sometimes he should fail you, it will be for a greater good. And that greater good doesn't mean that, oh, something better is coming. We don't know what is our greater good. Something that she says a lot is, God knows us a lot better than we do know ourselves. And so everything that comes to us is what we need. And this, experience that comes is what allows us to develop whatever it is that we need to develop at this point. So I'm going to be, and I'm already saying a lot, the word God, and I probably said devil, and I will say it again because of the words she uses. You are welcome to interpret those two words in any way you want. Under this roof, we have that freedom. And I will share with you very briefly what I consider to be God and the devil. God, I believe that none of them have personal characteristics. They are impersonal forces. God is this omnipresent, ineffable, eternal power that sustains everything that is alive. And that power also lives within us as a spark. So it's everything. God is also what sleeps within the human being and slowly awakens. And the devil, I see it as this, as the obstacles that come along the journey, that sometimes we can even call temptation, because they do tempt us. They tempt us to give up. They tempt us to take another road when we decided that we were going to take that one. It seems that whenever we really commit to do something, and I'm sure it has happened to all of us, whether it is prayer or meditation, or, I'm going to really try not to think badly of people or to gossip. And, it's like the moment we put this force in motion, there is an immediate response, sometimes, that wants to prevent that movement in the right direction. So I consider that to be that devil, that force that she called in that way. So before we go into prayer, one of the main vows of the Carmelite Discalced, which was the order that she founded, was poverty. And it was extreme poverty. So there was this commitment to live in a very austere and simple life. And the main reason is for them, they go all the way. But not to make this, a big gap between them and us. We can see that all that simplicity is needed when we want to devote our lives to what really matters. And right now, whatever is not that simplicity is a distraction. We can call it a big distraction. Recently, I was watching this talk by a priest, and he said that the priests in the congregation who had TV showed up at prayer less than those who didn't. I thought that was very funny, because I didn't know that those things can happen even within, a convent. But, that's such a reality for us. We have so many distractions, and the more we have, the more we get distracted, and the more we use our energy in those things. We have 10 pair of trousers that we have to wash. It's not the same as we have to wash one or two. So it's time. It's basically time that we put in other things instead of what is our priority, or if we want that to be our priority, of course. So they lived in such austerity that there is this funny account in which, so Teresa was having this ecstasies at any given time. She would also levitate at any given time. And the nuns in the convent were already used to it. But one time she was holding a pan with oil, and she had this moment of ecstasy, and the account says the nuns were really worried, but not because of the ecstasy, because they were very used to that, but because she was going to spill the last oil that they had in the convent. So that depicts more or less the type of life they were living. The other rule for them, or the other vow, was the pray without ceasing. Our primitive rule states that we must pray without ceasing. If we do this with all the care possible, for unceasing prayer is the most important aspect of the rule, the fasts, the disciplines, and the silence, the order commands will not be wanting. So she didn't say, this didn't mean you have to constantly pray vocally, like with words. This is a state of prayer, a state of that the Buddhists will call present moment awareness. It is just a state of coming back to where you are, recognizing that the divinity within you. So different mystics use different techniques, if we can call them that way. But the idea is always the same. It's going back to this moment, coming back to this moment as it is, and bringing the presence of a higher power. At least for the Christian mystics, it will be either the presence of Jesus or God. And some of them would center in the center of the chest and the center of the heart. Or I would say in the heart center. And then she says something that I could have completely left aside, but I thought it was very important. Prayer and comfortable living are incompatible. So whether we like to hear that or not, again, being realistic about our maybe sporadic or limited efforts into this path. And knowing that our approach to that light will be also limited. And then something else she says about prayer, if I had understood as I do now, that in this little palace of my soul dwells so great a king, I would not have left him alone so often. And this is one of the most powerful things that she shares all the time. She says, God is so close to us, or sometimes she'll say the Lord, sometimes you don't know if she's talking about Jesus or God. It is, and she says, we miss it because it is so incredibly close to us. So there's no purpose whatsoever of looking outside or looking anywhere else. We just need to look within, which makes it pretty easy. A very inspiring account, at least for me. One time she saw a small boy standing at the bottom of the stairway. Who are you? He asked her. She said, I am Teresa of Jesus, she answered, rather imperiously. And who are you? I am Jesus of Teresa, he said, and vanished. I thought that was the sweetest thing. And this account is part of an explanation about her being, questioning her visions. And who are you? So another person would just stand there, wondering what is going on. But she was very brave. Requisites for prayer. 3 virtues. She says, without them, contemplative prayer is impossible. And she uses the word impossible. Of course, she's talking about contemplative prayer, which is in her language, it would be a complete union with God. Probably what in Buddhism and Hinduism would be samadhi. So what she tries to convey here is that many times we think that we only need a technique, right? We don't need the method. So what is the method of prayer? I just want to know how she prayed. And doing that, I'm probably going to get where she got. But the first thing she tells you is, well, you need first to work on these 3 virtues. And at the same time, of course, you can practice prayer. But as long as you don't advance in these virtues, you will not advance in prayer, which makes perfect sense, doesn't it? If we see it in terms of vibration, we are trying to raise ourselves into a different state of being, and we cannot achieve that by 20 minutes of prayer or 2 hours of prayer. It has to be, the change has to be complete. Our whole being needs to walk in that direction. So it is, the sincere effort to cultivate right living, loving actions, loving speech, loving thoughts. And that's not easy. We have lifetimes of work just on that. But the work can start anytime. Like one of my favorite teachers says, start where you are. This is our chance to start or to continue. So change must be at all levels. So the 3 virtues are love, detachment, and humility. One of the things before I show you, I just picked one quote for each of them to show you a different aspect of what you may think of them. But of course, the obvious applies. She talks about feel compassion for other people's faults instead of getting frustrated or commenting about it. And I really like one recommendation that she gives: practice with great perfection the virtue opposite to the fault that appears in the other. So whenever we notice a fault in someone else, we can immediately think of the opposite virtue and try to practice it. That's a very practical advice. She talks about all kinds, different types of love. It would take us our whole time to talk about that. But I was blown away by the keen observations that she makes. And that's a result of self-knowledge, really, and observation of things. She says that we normally cannot follow this properly, either because of excess or defect. And defect we can all understand, we don't love enough. But then she talks about excess of love. And in this excess of loving one person, we're failing to love others equally. Or we're failing to love God above everything, above all things. So very, things you wouldn't normally think of. And the considerations are very specific, and she talks at length about them. And the one thing that I thought it was important to share is that quote. Now, it seems to me that those whom God brings to a certain clear knowledge love very differently than do those who have not reached it. This clear knowledge is about the nature of the world, that there is another world, about the difference between the one and the other, that the one is eternal and the other a dream. And I honestly never expected a Christian mystic to use these terms, which are very much found in Buddhism, Hinduism, in theosophical texts. This very clear notion that there is the world that we see, that apparently is a little bit like a dream. It's not that real as we think it is. And there is this other world that is eternal. And it's the one that actually counts. So whenever we put our energy and our love into the world that is a dream, we're really wasting our time. Because what really matters is what we're building in the other world, in the world of God. And then the next one is detachment. The very simple definition that she gives about detachment is not holding on to what is not eternal, not paying attention to what doesn't bring us closer to God. So anything that is going to attach us to whatever is going to change or die or modify or not exist eternally, we can work on slowly and gradually detaching from. We can always start with the things that are easier and move into the aspects that take more effort from us. And the quote that's selected for that was, "A great aid to going against your will is to bear in mind continually how all is vanity and how quickly everything comes to an end. This helps to remove our attachment to trivia and center it on what will never end. When we begin to become attached to something, we should strive to turn our thoughts from it and bring them back to God. And His Majesty helps." So we're not alone in that attempt. We always get help as well, if we're sincere. So I think it's quite clear, right? When we begin to become attached to something, well, we can reflect on the nature of that and bring our attention and bring ourselves into the things that are long-lasting. And the last one is humility, and of course it's a fundamental virtue. She says whoever has them, because she thinks detachment and humility go together, there is no way we can practice one or the other. Whoever has them can easily go out and fight with all held together and against the whole world and all its occasions of sin. Such a person has no fear of anyone, for his is the kingdom of heaven. He has no one to fear because he doesn't care if he loses everything, nor would he consider this a loss. Another story, and probably one of the most powerful ones, that inspired this statue by Bernini, Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. She says, "I saw an angel beside me toward the left side in bodily form. He was not very large, but small, very beautiful. His face so blazing with light that he seemed to be one of the very highest angels who appear all on fire. They must be those they call cherubim. I saw in his hands a long dart of gold, and at the end of the iron there seemed to me to be a little fire. This, I thought, he thrust through my heart several times, and that it reached my very entrails. As he withdrew it, I thought it brought them with it and left me all burning with a great love of God. So great was the pain that it made me give those moans, and so utter the sweetness that this sharpest of pains gave me, that there was no wanting it to stop, nor is there any contenting of the soul with less than God." So her conversations with God continued. At times you can tell that she's describing Jesus. She's having visions or hearing the voice of Jesus. And she knew these visions were not the goal, that these visions were just helping her to the further along the journey. because that's also as part of the mystic work. If we get stuck in the visions and the bliss of the ecstasy that is feeling, that is also part of the things that are changing and not eternal. So they continue. They use that as an opportunity and, of course, as guidance, most of all. And then I wanted to share with you a little bit of St. John of the Cross. So when Teresa was 52, she had already founded the convent of the Carmelite Descalzed. She was already a Carmelite, but she created the order of the Carmelite Descalzed. The word descalzed comes from the Spanish descalzo, which means barefoot. So they were either barefoot or wearing sandals, but it depicted the poverty, the vow of poverty. And one of the reasons they did that was she had a strong reaction to what was happening at that time within the convent of the Carmelites. And it happened that prayer was no longer the first priority, or silence. There were visitors coming all the time, high status people, like sometimes politicians or wealthy people. So the convent was turning into something that wasn't genuine or really seeking spirituality. So she decided that she needed to bring that back, and she needed to bring the teachings of Jesus back. And so she did. And she founded 17 convents, some of them with the help of others, among them St. John of the Cross. So when she was about to found another convent, she heard of St. John and sent people to bring him to her. And they began a most sincere friendship. It is said that St. John of the Cross's last attachment was Teresa. He realized that she was the last thing he was attached to. And when he realized that, he was holding in his chest some of the letters she had written to him. And when he realized that, he burned them and, in a way, let her go. But both of them had visions and levitated. Teresa would levitate after communion or in other more unexpected moments. At first, when she didn't know what's going on, she would ask the other nuns to hold her down because she didn't want to be seen like that. And you can imagine. So one time, one nun reported that when she entered the convent kitchen at dawn to stir the coals for morning tea, she found John and Teresa leaning toward one another in silence, while their chairs were hovering a few inches off the ground. And of course, this wasn't something that they were looking for or they were trying to achieve. This was just a consequence of their state of consciousness. It brings lightness, and you can find in the accounts of Teresa about these mystical experiences that what is happening is so complex that at times she cannot find the words to define it. And when it happens to be the body, when the body is not present, sometimes the body, the first thing that goes off, like it's unconscious, is the body. But then sometimes the memory remains, sometimes the memory is not there. And as she advances into these stages, you'll see that there is tremendous upliftment on everything, and with it also the physical body. John tried to help her with some of these powers that she developed, and he was less passionate, and he thought that it was her passion what caused all these things. So he gave her some advice. A funny account, despite the great affection and respect Teresa and John felt for each other, John didn't hesitate to reprove her. He told her, When you make your confessions, Mother, you think up the prettiest excuses for your sins. Don't we all? But he was very honest with her. And at times, for example, he tried to, well, this is happening after communion, and maybe because you have, the whole bread in your mouth, and that gives you this tremendous feeling of God inside of you. So they were trying to figure out how to help her with this. And he thought he would help her by just breaking the bread in half and giving just half the bread. And it didn't matter. She levitated anyway after she ate the bread. So. So, a little bit about prayer. One of the things we can learn from her is that prayer is for all of us. It doesn't mean that we're all mystics. It doesn't mean that we're all going to achieve contemplative prayer, but it does mean that we can all pray. And she gives instructions from the very beginning into the higher stages with such clarity. In the interior castle, in which she explains each of these stages of prayer, she gives very specific information of, in this stage, be aware of this or be aware of that. Careful with such thing and such a thing. Move in this direction. It's like someone who has been there can tell you, this is the way you drive. It doesn't mean that it's going to be exactly the same. Sometimes we take other roads to get there, but at least we have some reference. So she makes a basic distinction at the beginning of two types of prayer. The vocal prayer that we all know of, the one we say with our words, and then something she calls mental prayer. This mental prayer is not related to something that is mostly done with the mind, but it's a mind-heart prayer. And it starts, the basic foundation of it is a conversation with God or a conversation with Jesus. And the attempt to become closer and closer to their nature. She will normally meditate. This was also called meditation. She will meditate on the qualities of Jesus or the passions, and little by little moving into a state of being that was completely quiet. She had a very active mind, so it's not that she was born with the capacity to pray quietly. And I will share with you on Saturday accounts of how she dealt with that. But she was very aware of how active her mind was. And sometimes she will tell her nuns, you cannot pray today, and that's fine. Not every day you're going to, it's not that they were not allowed, they wouldn't pray. They would, in any way, they would attempt prayer. They had a 2-hour practice of prayer. But she would recognize the fact that it wasn't at all times possible to have a quiet mind able to reflect on these things, or even to reach the point of being completely quiet. So she had a lot of experience and shares that with us. So for her, this contemplative prayer at the beginning is nothing else but a close sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with who we know loves us. And like she said, he's so close to us. And she recommended that we always keep at the beginning the image of the teacher close to us for protection, but also for inspiration. And really what matters in prayer is not so much what we do, but what God does in us during those moments. So it is more of at first, a very active practice and then much more passive. In fact, there is a description, she makes a description of 4 stages of prayer in which she says, at first it's like, let's imagine that we're trying to cultivate this garden and we need to water it. So at first the effort is a lot. We have to bring buckets of water into the garden and walk our way back and bring the water. In the second stage of prayer, we use a wheel, one of those wheels that grab the water. And so then you just take that water and pour it into the garden. So it's less intensive labor. The third stage of prayer, in this third stage of prayer, we receive water from the ground, the channels that for irrigation. And so we receive that water at certain times, but it is there, and we don't have to walk and get it. It's coming, it's flowing to us. And she said the fourth stage is like rain. It pours into you. There's nothing you can do or cannot do. It just comes to you. I think that her favorite prayer was the Lord's Prayer. And it is, after all, the only prayer that Jesus shared. I recommend it. So, this is her most famous prayer. In Spanish, nada te turbe, nada te espante. Todo se pasa. Dios no se muda. La paciencia todo lo alcanza. Quien a Dios tiene, nada le falta. Solo Dios basta. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. All things are passing away. God never changes. Patience obtains all things. Whoever has God lacks nothing. God alone suffices. And this is by Jose de Ribera. And as you can see, there's a skull and a dove. And so it's a representation of both her inspiration, the eternal world, and the world of dreams, the one that dies. So it's the representation of death and the eternal. She wrote many poems, and this is just one of them. So, if by chance you forget where I am, do not rush around here and there. If you want to find me, seek me inside yourself. So, you are my room, you are my house, you are my dwelling. If through your distracted ways I ever find your door tightly closed, do not seek me outside yourself. To find me, it will be enough simply to call me, and I will come quickly. Seek me inside yourself.
So, do you think she had a near-death experience?
It's quite possible. I was hoping to read something about that, and I didn't find it. It didn't surprise me that she had that experience of dying in a way. You see that in other mystics as well, that they have, to some extent, some experiences that can be seen as near death, or sometimes they experience like parts of them dying. And so it wasn't surprising, but for sure she experienced things in the state of coma. Yeah.
What was the name of the book that you had at the very beginning?
Yes. Saint Teresa of Avila, Passionate Mystic, by Mirabai Starr. Beautiful book. Very inspiring. It inspired all this and a lot more. Now my house is full of books of Teresa of Avila. And all the ones that other people wrote about her. And now I saw a few more there that I don't have. But it's really not about the books. It really inspires you to try to practice. And at every level, not just with, in the sitting meditation or in the sitting prayer, but to practice with your loved ones, with your coworkers, with your friends, with people you don't know. To cultivate that, yeah.
We do have a question that was sent in.
Okay.
In your comments about who God is and who the devil is, God, a force, is within. Do you think the devil, this force, is also within us? If it is, how did it get there?
I may not have the answer to that question. I'm just going to share what I think. One of the things that I said is that I don't see the devil as with personal attributes, so it wouldn't be something that it gets in there. I believe that we have limitations, and those limitations become obstacles. In my view, limitations come from before, because I have a more, let's say, Buddhist perspective, and I believe in reincarnation. So I think that we bring those elements that we still need to work on. So they are with us, and they are within us. Actually, I believe that most of our obstacles are within. And we many times, the external circumstances are just a reflection of those limitations that we bring. So is it outside or inside? Hard to say. But I definitely won't see it as in terms of an entity or a person.
Thank you. Another question also been sent in. Some female mystics were burnt at the stake for similar practices. What did she do differently to not meet that same fate?
Yes. I said something at the beginning that is related to that. She liked to be liked. So she made a great effort to be liked. And which means she was very charismatic, and she was extremely capable with her intellect of pretty much convincing everybody about what she thought. That's why John tells her, you find the prettiest excuses for your sins. And she found she was at the level of the conversation, and she could tell people things that they may not know. At the same time, I think it's just a matter of the role that she had to fulfill within the church. She was a reformer, and together with St. John of the Cross, the two people who actually actively spoke about prayer. So I'm not saying that other saints were less important, and that's why they got there. I think it was just some element of luck, or the fact that she needed to go through that particular experience alive. I also had the feeling that she was connected with the right people. She was in a way protected by the right people. And by that I mean learned men who believed in her and protected her. But if you read her, if you read her writings, she apologizes so much about what she's saying. She's like, I know nothing about this. I am nobody. I'm the worst sinner in the whole world. So she says that every 2 sentences. And you're like, well, okay, just stop it. Let me just read what you have to say. I'm in the 2017. But maybe that helped her too. It was, very humble, but also very apologetical.
In your readings, did you learn about how she was able to detach? How did she practice that? What did she do? Did she share about struggles with detachment?
Yeah, I cannot think of a particular example. Right now, nothing is really coming to mind about like a story or something like that. But she, because she had this very keen self-observation, whenever she felt that there was attachment, she would be able to see it and work on it and let go of it. I think that what happens with attachment is that it sneaks in, and then we realize it when it's quite big, and then the work begins. But she gives us a clue that is, contemplate the things that are eternal. And even when this doesn't make sense, sometimes we're attached to a problem that we have, or an idea, or a person. And we can always try to bring the mind to things that are of the soul. And so that cultivates that state of being instead of of the world that she spoke about, the changes, and it's like a dream. So that's all I have.
Another question from someone online. Any similarities between her and Ramana Maharshi that you can think of?
Yes. Definitely the meditation in the heart, or prayer in the heart, that is common in all Christian mystics. Ramana Maharshi spoke, who is, by the way, a Hindu mystic, spoke of the practice of focusing on the divinity within, in the center of the chest. Austerity, constant prayer, constant meditation. Ramana Maharshi spent years in a cave. When Teresa speaks of the place in which John of the Cross meditated, she said, I went there with 2 merchants, 2 people that accompanied me. They did nothing but weep. They were just weeping of the energy that there was in that place. And it was just, in the description, it really sounds like a cave where there was no comfort whatsoever. And they would just spend hours and days in contemplation. So yeah, those are the things that I can think of right now.
You mentioned that she was a doctor of the church. Do you know from your readings of any of the qualities that she would have for that?
I don't know exactly. I read that it was because of her theologian, let's say, knowledge that she brought. My impression of it is that within the journey of the soul, there is certain amount of information that priests at those levels have. And she filled a lot of the gaps that they didn't know about. And so she helped construct the doctrine of the church in a way like giving, this is my piece, this is my contribution to it. But that didn't happen until 1970. She was canonized in the 1600s, so that happened right away. But she was considered doctor of the church in 1970. So that was quite recent.
What language did she write in?
Spanish.
Oh, so you could read the. Is it the same Spanish we know now, or it's an ancient Spanish?
You know, it's Spanish from Spain, and it is so old, and I mean in the sense that it was like more of an old type of structure and words, and that it was easier for me to read in English than in Spanish, even though I speak the language. Sometimes, like, I wouldn't understand what she meant. The description and the words, I would be totally confused. So I was like, no, let's just do it in English. But it's a pity that I couldn't read that. Now her poetry is, of course, much more beautiful in Spanish.
How did she meet St. John of the Cross?
In what context, do you mean? So she found out about him. There was this young friar who was being very committed to the spiritual life, unlike many others. And, you know, I really don't know how you get to hear about these things in the 1500s, but you do, because those things travel. And so she sent someone to get him. And he went to her and met her at the convent of St. Joseph.